The Middle Byzantine era represents a real turning point in the history of Christian sacred art, and really the beginning of a tradition that is recognizably our own as Orthodox Christians. As we left off last lecture with the end of Iconoclasm, so much of what was going on in this Byzantine era was a shift between an unsustainably large and anxious ancient empire that was moving into a more economically stable, socially homogeneous, and militarily defensible medieval-style kingdom. And a lot of tendencies that are associated with medieval art as distinguishable from classical art, we do find that in the Middle Byzantine art. So the art really picks off right where it left off. It's important to note that there wasn't really, during the Iconoclasm, it was tragic and there was a lot of art that was lost. But art continued to be made, even if it was secular art. We have lots of, records of decorated palaces of the emperor, where instead of, sacred scenes, they would depict historical scenes or hunting scenes. So we know that over, more or less the century of iconoclasm, technical skills weren't necessarily lost, and art continued to be produced. So the art that emerges right after iconoclasm is almost indistinguishable from what came before. There are examples of iconoclasm in the archaeological record. So we have mosaics that have been scratched off and replaced with cross designs. So we do find the iconoclasm in the archaeological record, but we don't really see it in the art itself. Its development. But we do see shifts after the iconoclasm. So right after, maybe not, but as we move into this new medieval world, we have medieval tendencies. And one of the most characteristic aspects of medieval art, as distinguishable from classical art, is now a focus on color and a focus on pattern. Medieval art has this great vitality, this great exuberance that we obviously do see color and pattern in that late antique art. I'm thinking of the mosaics of Ravenna, but there is still a classical sensibility to it. There is still a formal a poise, a formal balance, and a lot of those formal principles of art began to dissolve as we move into the medieval period. And we see this in icon painting, where the forms are not only are they stylized classical forms like they were in the late antique period, we have the reintroduction of movement, but it's not classical movement. It's not contrapposto that the Greeks developed. So it's not this very balanced movement. It's just movement for its own sake, pattern for its own sake. And that is part of the tradition. This is a phase the tradition went through, this movement into pattern as distinguished from form. And other than the lavish decorative schemes, I would point to two aspects of Middle Byzantine painting that are most characteristic of this medieval shift, and that is how the garments are handled. So you see this very lavish treatment of flowing garments and excessive folds. Now, this is not entirely new in the Greco-Roman painting tradition, but the Middle Byzantine tradition really focus on it, and it becomes sort of a stereotypical aspect. We can date paintings in the Middle Byzantine period by how they handle folds. That's how characteristic of an element this actually is. Another aspect is the completely unnatural body proportions. So, artists for a long time have exaggerated body proportions, made figures taller than they would naturally be, but at this point we see any kind of reference to nature leaves completely, and we have this preference for elongated bodies and also really rounded forms. Again, this is not classical contrapposto. The forms are rounded for the sake of how they fit into the composition as a whole, but we do see this preference now for these very elegant rounded shapes that are mirrored or accentuated by the folds of the garments. So this is almost removing into pure pattern, leaving behind that classical balanced composition and movement via contrapposto. One of the most characteristically medieval aspects of the art of this period is the sheer multiplication of detail that is in the icon. Now, this is not all that unrelated to what came before. So if you remember in the late Byzantine period, there was a lot of busyness in terms of the decorative schema, but the scenes themselves were relatively simple figures doing clear acts. But what we see in the Middle Byzantine era is all kinds of different little details that are in the icons. Think of the icon of the baptism of the Lord. It's not just John and Christ. Now you have the heavens opening up, you have a dove, sometimes you have different personifications of the waters and the River Jordan, you have the angels doing different things, you have things lying on the ground. We have all these details now in the iconography. And I remember when I was first beginning to study iconography, I met with an older priest who himself was an iconographer. And I asked him, I've read all these books, I can decode an icon if pressed, but is there one place where I can find basically a sort of a decoder that tells me what all these details are and what they signify? And the priest just chuckled at me and he said, well, yeah, come to Vespers. And at first I didn't understand what he meant, but it was, in exploring and actually in living our liturgical tradition, that I eventually understood what he was trying to communicate, is that all of the details that are in the icon, they're only in the icon because they were first in the hymnography of the church. We sing about these details at Vespers, at Orthros, and in our other services. So what happens in this Middle Byzantine period is, remember, at the end of Iconoclasm, it was the victory of monasticism, it was the victory of a monastic style to liturgy, and it was the victory for this very elaborate hymnography that still is part of our tradition to this day. And that hymnography was actually now influencing the iconography itself. So all of those little details that we sing about are imported into the icon. Think of something like the Akathis hymn, It's a brief scene. The figures, if it was in the classical period, it would be Mary and the Archangel Gabriel. But what does the Akathist hymn do? Well, it draws this encounter out into this elaborate theological discourse, this elaborate conversation, and it imports all kinds of biblical typology. It basically surrounds this scene with a whole matrix of meaning. It's interpreting that event, that historia, in a theoria. So that's what the hymnography does. It takes the mysteries of faith and elaborates them and contextualizes them. And that's what we see also in the hymnography. We see that technique that is used in the hymnography is now imported into the iconography. So we have an elaboration of details, and if you want to know what this or that detail means in icons, well, come to Vespers, come to Orthros. If you can't do that, you can get your hands on the proper hymns of those feasts, like something like the Transfiguration, for example, and just reading through those hymns, you will start to now understand the iconography that is cooperating with the liturgy. And this is also a shift that happens in the intellectual culture. So, if you remember all the way back to the Iconoclasm, it was really this sort of highbrow Platonism that was the intellectual class that were the ones, opposing predominantly the use of icons. But after the iconoclasm, that completely shifts to where you have, the great Saint Photius, the great patriarch of Constantinople, who's this, intellectual first, before he becomes, a church leader. So basically, we have a rapprochement between the intelligentsia and the Christian tradition, to where before you could, display your erudition by quoting Plato and being all, about the nous and a spiritualized reality. After iconoclasm, it was all about this hymnography, this literature where you can impress people by, this beautiful icon, and you can explain what all the details mean by connecting it to this or that hymn. So there was a shift in the intellectual culture away from this sort of dematerialized Platonism and more into where it became in vogue to understand the typologies of the church. People were reading the sermons of the church fathers. People were excited and composing hymnography. So there also is an intellectual shift that is taking place during the after the iconoclastic period. Another factor that makes the icons of this period, increase in complexity is we have the first standardization of the depictions of the saints. So as we've spoken of before, there were standard depictions. So we knew, St. Peter was depicted this way, St. Simeon, the stylite, was depicted that way, so forth and so on. Like saints like St. Demetrius had a standard iconography because he had a standard cult. But after the iconoclasm, we really do have this full liturgical incorporation of the veneration of the saints. Different, it's not just this saint or that saint that has a local veneration that becomes sort of universalized. We actually have different now classes of saints, or the common of the saints. So we venerate monastics, we venerate hierarchs, we venerate martyrs. So there is a standardization of how saints are engaged with liturgically, and that actually manifests in the iconography, where you have a standardization of depictions of martyrs, of monastics, of monarch saints, of hierarchs. And not only do we have that, we also have the invention of what's called the vita icon. So it's an icon, of the main saint in the middle, and then all around are scenes from the life of the saints. And we also have a new form of liturgical literature, the Synaxaria. So what saints are venerated when, and oftentimes in these, especially in the Great Synaxarion, we have all of the sort of the glimpses of the lives of the saints, and these are all illustrated. They're also illustrated in Book of Hours. So we have illustrated horologia, where we have different lives of the saints and their martyrdoms. So all of this is to say that as the liturgy is growing in its complexity and its standardization, that's having a direct impact on the icons that the church is producing. So now if we venerate a saint every day, and it's in our official calendar of saints, then we need an icon to correspond to that saint on the calendar. And to make this even simpler in this era, we have the invention of what are called calendar icons. So let's say it's just impossible to have an icon of each saint for each day. Well, you can have a whole icon of all the saints of January, for example. And those are some of the icons that are preserved in the Middle Byzantine era. Another feature of Middle Byzantine art is really a movement almost in the opposite direction. So that's what makes this period, and really all periods of great art, what makes them interesting and exciting is they always begin invariably with tremendous experimentation, different movements going in different directions, doing different things, and they end with a consolidation where you're taking the gains of these experiments and bringing them all together. And that's what happens in this Middle Byzantine era as well. But one of the other directions that the art was moving is a movement towards what we call monumentality. So the exact opposite of the detail and the busyness and the pattern, we do in this period also see these great monumental icons. Actually, the Theotokos in the apse of the Hagia Sophia is a perfect example of this. We have this very dark figure, this monumental figure on a gold ground. And we see that time and time again, a monumental figure with very dark clothing on a gold ground. So we really get that really monumental silhouette. And many scholars have actually linked this to currents that were going on in Byzantine spirituality. So it's part of the victory of monasticism, but it's a little deeper than that. It's older than that, but it's also deeper than that. And this movement, we could call it hesychasm, but we'll actually address hesychasm in the next lecture. It's before a real formal hesychasm. And the saint that perfectly exemplifies this current in Byzantine spirituality is really Saint Simeon, the new theologian. And he's very unique in the history of Orthodox spirituality. Unlike the West, most of what we have in terms of the spiritual literature are the sayings, the axioms, the stories, but we don't really have a lot of autobiographical material. In the West, there's Augustine, and he started this whole tradition where, writing about one's personal experience with God is a standard convention. Even today, in the Western churches, that is how spirituality is explored. In the East, it was very different. With one, or actually a handful over the ages, but with one notable early example, and that's Saint Simeon, the new theologian, who wrote these very intense treatises. He did also write poetry, but he wrote autobiographical accounts of his encounters with God. And one of the central motifs of these encounters are what he calls the divine light of God. And it was this immediacy of divine experience and the medium, so to speak, of light, or the phenomenology of light that is really significant in his work. And we can interpret that as part of what's going on in this monumentality. Because if you look at this monumentality, it isn't static. The figures can be a little rigid, but when you look at the faces of the Middle Byzantine period, it's almost as if they're radiating light. Even though their faces are dark, we see that light, that experience of direct divine encounter is taking place. So even in the monumentality, we have this real, how do I want to put it? It's not a formalism. It's really that immediacy of divine experience that Saint Simeon, is so exemplary of. So when you look at the faces, I'm actually thinking of one of the most famous examples of Middle Byzantine art, which is the Vladimir Mother of God. And we call it Vladimir because eventually it wound up in Vladimir in Russia, but it was painted in Constantinople at this time. And when you look at that image, you are encountering the divine. The divine light is shining through the figures, shining through the gold, and all of that monumentality is really just a backdrop for that immediacy. So we have these different facets of Middle Byzantine art, the busyness, the monumentality, and all of those eventually really merge together by the end of this period. But before I talk about the consolidation of all of these different movements, it also is important to note that it was at this time that Byzantine art was really exported to the rest of the world. Now, the relationship between Byzantine art and Western art, or Western Roman art, is a little is a little different. So they both come from the same source. They're both, in a sense, we could call, they're sub-Roman. They're what happened after Rome, and there continues to be similarity, like between, let's say, the Romanesque art, which was the Gothic, primarily Gothic art, that was a Gothic adoption of the art of Rome, but it was different. It was uniquely Gothic, but it was still that Roman tradition. It was before Goths developed their own aesthetic language in the High Middle Ages. So it's related to Byzantine art. Sometimes when you look at it, it's hard to even tell the difference, but there's not so much a direct influence as they're both like coming from the same lineage. So that relationship is a little interesting. But what I would note is that at this period too, there wasn't a real clear distinction between the two. They recognized their common lineage, and Constantinople as the center of Christian culture, as really the place where the arts were taken to their highest aesthetic standard. There was a tremendous export of Byzantine art to the Western world. I'm thinking in particular, in the Middle Byzantine era, it became very popular to have Greek mosaicists decorate Western churches. I'm thinking particularly in Sicily and also in Rome. So there was a influx of Byzantine art back west. There's even a whole school of icon painting associated with Italy. Scholars refer to it as the Italio-Byzantine school. The famous San Damiano crucifix that is associated with the Western saint, St. Francis, that is painted in this Italio-Byzantine school. So there's one level of influence back towards the West, but at this time as well, Byzantine art is now being exported to places that it wasn't necessarily there before. So it's adopted really by the Coptic Church. So the Church of Egypt that isn't really the Greek-speaking people of the metropolis. It's the Coptic speakers, the indigenous inhabitants of Egypt. They're now appropriating this Byzantine iconography, and it's even traveling south of Egypt into eventually all the way into Ethiopia. So we have this whole great tradition of Ethiopian art, Ethiopian Orthodox iconography, and that's beginning to develop in this period as Greek art has this cultural hegemony. Also, it's spreading into Armenia, spreading into what is now the Islamic world. So it's influencing the Syriac iconography. There was always a connection between Syriac and Byzantine iconography, but we do see it in this period. It's also moving into places that had no connection, like Georgia, in the Caucasus, and most significantly, we would say for the history of Byzantine sacred art is it's moving into the Rus. So as the Rus are beginning to be evangelized, they're evangelized, of course, by Greeks. We have the importation of Byzantine iconography, and because it's happening at this time, it's that Middle Byzantine iconography that's first, flooding into the rapidly converting Rus, the rapidly converting Slavic world. So again, that example of the Virgin of Vladimir is really a premier example of this phenomenon. But it doesn't take long before the Rus themselves are also painting icons. So the tradition is spreading all over the world at this period. So as I've mentioned, this is a great period of expansion, a great period of experimentation where we have different movements going in sometimes even opposite directions, but the style of this period does come together and does solidify into something recognizably Middle Byzantine. And the factor behind that is actually a political shift that takes place. So we have the rise of what's called the Macedonian Dynasties, where you had a series of emperors originally from Macedon, from the province in Greece. And what happens in this Macedonian dynasty is court life enters into a new stage of elegance. Remember, the iconoclasts were very interested in austerity, getting back to these very noble, austere Roman militaristic virtues, and that put the Rome, or at this point we may call Byzantium, in a much better military and ultimately economic footing. But there was something of a reintroduction of more sophisticated courtly life that takes place in Constantinople at this period as well. And that is done, again, by these Macedonian emperors. And what happens with these Macedonian emperors is they're importing courtly life, but what they're also importing back into the capital is this love for classical antiquity. At this point, we get very interesting antiquarian art where they're self-consciously trying to copy Greco-Roman art. So here's a third current that's taking place, but it's this current, this reintroduction of classical balance and even things like contrapposto we see again. This approach to really reining in the details, like going with the coattails of that monumentality and integrating it with that medieval sense of pattern, but now with this classical sensibility of good and well-ordered balance. And in this conflux that is all going on in the capital, we do see the emergent of what's the stereotypical Middle Byzantine style that has sort of been refined by this classical influence into something that is now homogeneous and really elegant and very beautiful. So if we were to, give a leitmotif of this age, it would be standardization, and not in a stiff, oftentimes we think of the word standardization and that it doesn't seem to be an aesthetic principle, but it actually is an aesthetic principle. So we see this formation of a very effective visual language, and that's really what I mean by standardization. Now the art can communicate in a consistent way, has a clear vocabulary, and has a clear grammar, and it's really out of this period of standardization where the church is fully confident in the artistic tradition that the art of the church is standardized. Now we know this, icon goes here. This is how such and such scene is depicted. This is how such and such saint or class of saint is depicted. So that is why in this period we can see something that is recognizably our Orthodox tradition, because it's really here that Orthodox tradition found its classical form. The styles can change and have changed and will change, but the form itself crystallizes at this point. And for all the grandeur of the Middle Byzantine art and all of the elegance and all of the export, we do have to keep in mind the end of this period. So in all artistic periods, they're all arbitrary. The art, it's not like it suddenly shifts, but we like to use certain events that can, almost act as place markers in which to see an artistic period. And the end of this period is what we call the Latin conquest of Constantinople. So as you may know, the Islamic world's conquest of the Middle East was very traumatic for Christianity, because so much of the Middle East was Christian. It was the center of the Christian, cosmos, really. And that had a certain reaction, particularly in the Western Christian world, of the whole phenomenon of crusades, where you had Westerners and Western monarchs coming through the eastern lands and seeking to reconquer those lost areas, particularly Palestine, but also Syria and Egypt. But one of these crusades, particularly the Fourth Crusade, went very much awry. It's really relatively straightforward. What happened historically is that the crusade was mostly made up of Venetians, this crusade, and a lot of the other powers that were going to bankroll and so fund and supply the military for this crusade backed out at the last minute. So the Venetians found themselves having spent tremendous amounts of capital getting ready for this campaign to retake the Holy Land, and they were left basically holding the bag. And instead of going on campaign to the Holy Land, they decided, there's a lot of very wealthy, friendly cities along the way to the Holy Land that might be a better target. So first they conquered several places in what's today, I believe it's Montenegro. So just all along the coast there. So as you're sailing down from Venice, there's lots of little targets that they conquered. And at this point, they were declared no longer a crusade. They were just a marauding army, but we still call it the Fourth Crusade. But eventually, they decided to target Constantinople itself. Now, Venice was a great trading partner and great trading rival with Byzantium. They were both, trying to occupy the same dominance in the Aegean, the same economic control. So what the Venetians decided to do is, instead of, going for the Holy Land, let's take out Constantinople. At this point, the relationships between the churches were already frayed, so they had at least the pretense of, these are heretic Christians, so they're, fair game as far as a crusade is concerned. And the Venetians turned towards Constantinople and eventually did conquer the city. And we had this tremendous and traumatic period of rape and pillage. There's stories about harlots dancing on the high altar of Hagia Sophia, and it just goes on and on. The real trauma of the Fourth Crusade, of a Christian army conquering a Christian kingdom under the pretense of a crusade, it's quite astonishing. But what happened in this period is all of that material wealth was basically extracted from Byzantium, and really, the empire does survive. It's a long history, but it never really recovers from the Latin conquest. But that basically ends the period of the Middle Byzantine era, and because of this rather traumatic history, with great irony, most of our surviving examples of Middle Byzantine art are actually found in the West. Because they were taken as spoils of war. The Western conquerors set up sort of a mock empire in Constantinople, referred to as the Latin Empire, and I believe it went on for about 70 years. So there was really a systematic pillaging of the Byzantine artistic heritage deported to the West. A great example is the high altar of Hagia Sophia itself is now in Venice. A lot of the Middle Byzantine icons are in Venice. And it did have a tremendous influence in how Western art would develop, but it also led to a very interesting phenomenon of the miracle-working icons in the West. So we've already spoken of miracle-working icons, but if you did a Google search of the icon painted by St. Luke, there's all kinds of cathedrals in Western Europe that purportedly have the icon painted by St. Luke. Well, what are these icons? Well, there's this phenomenon where sacred art was taken out of the Eastern Church, and the relics were taken out of the Eastern Church, and with the art, they were sort of repackaged and exported to the West. So if you take a beautiful icon of the Mother of God from this church in Constantinople, how are you going to package it in the West? Well, this is a miracle-working icon of St. Luke, and you're going to install that in your cathedral and get your pilgrimage. Same thing with the relics. So, and that's actually, this is the point where the Mendelion, the icon not made by hands of King Abgar, becomes Veronica's veil. it's repurposed and the whole story is repackaged into something that more fits into the passion centric piety of emergent medieval Westerners. So that's a very interesting phenomenon, as we have lots of Middle Byzantine icons in Western Europe that have been repackaged and have a different backstory, so to speak. So that's how this era ends. It led to tremendous wealth, but perhaps the wealthiest the empire ever was, a tremendous flourishing in artistic creation, and it all more or less came crashing down with the wholesale conquest of Byzantium, of the Eastern Empire, by the Venetians.